In the Texas Panhandle, back in 1874, the wind had a way of telling secrets. It swept across endless plains, rattling the windows of dim saloons and carrying whispers from one town to the next. But one man carried a silence heavier than any storm. His name was William Carter, the wealthiest cattle baron for 100 miles around. A man feared for his power, but pitied for his solitude. He was a king on a throne of dust and cattle, but his fortress of a ranch house was empty. Loneliness was a ghost that walked the halls beside him. So when word got out that he'd finally agreed to an arranged marriage, the town folk talked, and their tongues were sharp. They said he was desperate. They said he was settling for a woman no other man would ever want, a woman they called plain, a woman they called ugly. William heard the rumors, and in the quiet of his study, staring at the endless horizon, he believed them. He saw the marriage as a duty, a contract to secure an heir for his empire. Love was a language he didn't speak, so he signed his name on the dotted line without a second thought, resigning himself to a future of cold convenience. He had no idea that destiny was already riding toward him on a dusty trail, carrying a secret that would shatter his pride and burn his world to the ground. The morning of the wedding arrived under a pale, unforgiving sun. The light cut through the dust that always hung in the air, making the whole world look hazy and unreal. William Carter stood on the steps of the small wooden church, his hat pulled low, his jaw set like stone. He watched the road where it disappeared into the prairie, waiting. Around him, the crowd gathered, their voices a low murmur, like bees in a hive. He could hear the words, even if they were whispered. "The Baron's unlucky bride," they said. "A woman no man would pick if he had a choice." William stood tall, his shoulders stiff, but inside, a heavy shame settled in his gut. He'd let himself believe it. He'd accepted the town's judgment as fact. This wasn't a marriage. It was a sentence. Then he heard it. The rattle of carriage wheels on the hard-packed earth. A plain buggy, pulled by two tired-looking horses, came into view. The paint was chipped. There were no ribbons, no lace, nothing to suggest a celebration. Only the tired creak of old wood announcing the arrival of the woman who was about to take his name. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. The carriage door opened slowly, and a slender figure stepped out. She moved with a quiet, careful grace, dressed in a faded gown that looked more like a servant's dress than a wedding dress. Her head was bowed, her face hidden by a thin, plain veil. She carried no flowers, no jewelry. Just a small bundle tied in cloth, the kind a person carries when they have nothing else to their name. William's throat went tight. It wasn't anger. It was a dull, hollow disappointment that felt worse than anger. This was exactly what he'd expected. A simple woman, already broken by gossip before she even stepped foot in his town. He forced his face to remain a mask of indifference as he tipped the brim of his hat. A flicker of doubt stirred in him, a strange unease he couldn't name. The crowd leaned in, craning their necks, hungry for the first look at the face behind the veil. But she kept it hidden, her steps measured and small as she walked toward the church. William fell in step beside her, the sound of his boots loud and heavy on the wooden planks. He thought, "This is my life now, bound to a silent stranger." But her silence was different than his. His was born of power and solitude. Hers felt intentional. It felt like a warning. It felt like the calm before a storm. Inside the church, the air was thick and still. The only sound was the creak of the pews as the townsfolk settled in, their eyes locked on the veiled woman at the altar. William stood beside her, feeling the weight of their stares. He felt like a fool. A powerful man who had been tricked into marrying a woman no one wanted. The preacher's voice began to roll through the small chapel, each word of the vows landing like a blow. Then came the moment. The preacher paused, his voice echoing in the silence. "The bride will now reveal herself before God and her husband." A collective breath was drawn. William braced himself. With fingers that trembled just slightly, the woman reached up to the edge of her veil. Slowly, she lifted the thin cloth. It fell away from her face, and a stunned gasp ripped through the crowd. It wasn't the plain, unwanted woman from the rumors. The woman standing before him was radiant. Her face was soft, but etched with a strength that seemed to command the very air in the room. Her eyes, bright and clear, held a quiet courage that silenced every whisper, every snide comment. In that one shattering moment, William Carter, the hardened cattle baron, felt his chest seize with a shock so profound it almost buckled his knees. Shame, hot and sharp, flooded his mind. He had judged her. He had condemned her without ever seeing her face. She didn't smile with vanity. She didn't carry the arrogance of a woman who knows she's beautiful. Her expression was one of pure, unshakable dignity. And William understood instantly. The modest dress, the plain carriage, the veil, it wasn't a sign of poverty or shame. It was a test of character. She valued respect over appearance, substance over gossip. And with the simple act of lifting her veil, she had proven herself more powerful than any rumor. His throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't from disappointment. It was from guilt, a burning regret for his own blind pride. He had swallowed the lies whole, never once questioning them. He had been a fool. As the ceremony continued, her voice, gentle but unwavering, filled the church as she spoke her vows. The words loyalty, trust, and honor seemed to carry a weight he'd never understood before. They were worth more than all his cattle, all his land. He knew then. He wasn't standing before an unlucky bride. He was standing before a queen in disguise, a woman who could command a room without raising her voice, a woman who had just redrawn the map of his entire life. The townsfolk sat in stunned silence, their earlier cruelty hanging in the air like a bad smell. William's heart hammered against his ribs. Fate hadn't betrayed him. It had handed him a gift, wrapped in humble cloth, and he had almost thrown it away. When their hands met for the first time, a strange jolt passed between them. He felt the weight of his own foolishness, but underneath it, something else was taking root. A future he never thought possible. But as he looked into her courageous eyes, he saw something else there, too. A shadow. A hint of a story far darker than any small-town gossip. The veil was lifted, but the secrets, he was beginning to realize, were just getting started. The afternoon sun beat down as they left the church, the dust swirling around them. William walked beside his new wife, Eleanor, a storm of shame and confusion raging inside him. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of how easily he had believed the lies. He had judged a book by its cover, and the cover had been a deliberate deception. But who was deceiving whom? In the quiet of the sprawling ranch house, the silence between them was a heavy blanket. He needed to apologize, to explain, but he didn't know how. It was Eleanor who spoke first. She sensed his turmoil, and she told him a story. She said the whispers about her being ugly weren't just random gossip. They were a weapon, wielded by bitter neighbors who resented her family's poverty. They had faced drought and hunger, and instead of help, they had received mockery. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain beneath the surface. It was a story of cruelty and survival. William felt his gut twist with a fresh wave of regret. He had been one of them, in his own way. He had believed the mockery. But before he could find the words to say he was sorry, the world outside exploded. A low rumble grew into a deafening thunder of hooves. The ground itself began to tremble. "Stampede!" a voice screamed from the corral. Dust billowed into the sky, a brown cloud that blotted out the sun. A section of the fence was down, and hundreds of panicked cattle were surging toward the open plain. Ranch hands were shouting, horses were rearing, and chaos reigned. William, acting on instinct, sprinted toward the disaster. But in the midst of the mayhem, he glanced back. and he saw Eleanor. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't running for cover. She was running toward the danger. Her wedding dress was already torn and dirty. She snatched a fallen lasso from the ground, her movements fluid and sure. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the rope spinning through the air, its loop settling perfectly over the horns of a charging steer. It was a throw that would have made his most seasoned cowboys jealous. Her voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. She wasn't just helping, she was directing. She was telling men twice her size where to go, how to turn the herd, how to close the gap. She stood her ground, a lone figure against a tide of charging beasts, her eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with her beauty. In that moment, William didn't see a bride. He saw a warrior. Together, they fought the chaos. They rode, they roped, they yelled until their throats were raw. Slowly, painstakingly, they brought the herd under control. When the last steer was safely back in the pen and the dust began to settle, William saw her standing there, chest heaving, her face smeared with dirt. The strength radiating from her was more breathtaking than her face. It was a beauty forged in hardship, a beauty that made the town's gossip seem like a child's fairy tale. He finally understood. The lies about her weren't just lies. They were a profound underestimation. Respect, pure and simple, washed over him, drowning the last dregs of his hollow pride. He walked toward her, his hat in his hand, and the words finally came. Not a fancy speech, but a raw, honest apology. He admitted his shame. He acknowledged her honor. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, William felt the ground shift beneath him. This marriage was no longer a business arrangement. It was something else entirely. It was a partnership forged in dust and danger. But as he looked at the broken fence, a cold thought slithered into his mind. That fence hadn't just fallen. The wood was splintered, the posts snapped clean through. It had been cut. The stampede wasn't an accident. It was an attack, and it had happened on his wedding day. The days that followed were a quiet storm. William watched his wife, this woman named Eleanor, and saw a person of impossible contradictions. She could be gentle, tending to the small garden she'd started near the house, her hands patient with the soil. Then, an hour later, he'd see her in the corral, breaking a wild stallion with a calm ferocity that left his men speechless. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and it both fascinated and terrified him. The stampede had been deliberate. He knew it in his bones. He doubled the patrols along his fence lines and questioned his men, but found nothing. No one saw anything. It was as if a ghost had crept onto his land, struck, and vanished. But Eleanor? She seemed to be watching too. Not the fences, but the men. Her eyes would linger on one ranch hand, then another, a flicker of calculation in her gaze that made William's skin crawl. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the colors of the sunset bleed across the sky, he finally asked her, "You weren't surprised by the stampede?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. "In my life," she said, her voice low and even, "I've learned to expect trouble. It's the only thing that's never disappointed me." The answer told him nothing and everything all at once. A week later, one of his best foremen, a man named Jake, was found at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken. His horse was found grazing peacefully nearby. It was ruled a tragic accident, a fall in the dark. But William knew Jake. He was one of the most experienced riders in the whole Panhandle. He didn't just fall from his horse. When William went to the spot himself, he found something the sheriff had missed. A single high-quality cigar butt, half-smoked, lying in the dirt. William didn't smoke cigars, and neither did any of his men. He felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. His land, his empire, was under siege from an enemy he couldn't see. And his new wife was at the center of it all. He had to know who she really was. He hired a private detective from Austin, a man with a reputation for discretion. He gave him Eleanor's name and the name of the town she claimed to be from. He told him to dig up everything. While he waited for news, the tension on the ranch grew thicker every day. Tools would go missing. A barn door would be left open, spooking the horses. Small things, designed to unnerve him, to make him feel like he was losing control. And through it all, Eleanor moved with that same unsettling calm. One night, he woke up to find her gone from their bed. He found her in his study, a lamp burning low, poring over his maps of the territory. She was tracing the water routes, the grazing lands, the borders of his property. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. She didn't flinch. She looked up at him, her eyes clear. "I'm looking for your weaknesses," she said simply. "Because your enemy already has." The directness of it stunned him. Before he could respond, she pointed to a spot on the map, a narrow pass that led to his northern pastures. "This is where they'll hit next. They'll try to poison the watering hole. It would cripple your herd before the winter." He was furious. How could she possibly know that? Was she part of this? Was this whole marriage a long, elaborate con to destroy him from the inside? "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. She stood up, her gaze never leaving his. "I am your wife," she said. "And I am the only person on this ranch you can trust." The sincerity in her voice was absolute, but the facts didn't add up. It felt like a lie, a beautiful, convincing lie. 3 days later, the telegram arrived. It was from the detective in Austin. It was short, and every word was a hammer blow. "Town of Redemption burned to the ground 2 years ago. No record of an O'Malley family ever living there. No survivors of the fire officially listed. The woman calling herself Eleanor O'Malley does not exist." William read the telegram 3 times. The paper trembled in his hand. "Does not exist." He looked out the window and saw her near the corral, talking to one of the ranch hands, her posture calm, her smile gentle. A ghost. He had married a ghost. A beautiful, capable, dangerous ghost. And she was living in his house, sleeping in his bed, and mapping out the slow destruction of his entire world. He walked out onto the porch, the telegram crushed in his fist, his heart a block of ice in his chest. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth. Even if the truth killed him. He confronted her in the barn, the smell of hay and leather thick in the air. He held out the crumpled telegram, his hand shaking with a rage he could barely control. "It says here you don't exist," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It says your town burned down and your family never lived there. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Who are you?" She looked at the telegram, then back at him. The calm expression on her face finally cracked. For the first time, he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. She took a deep breath. "My name is not Eleanor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And the rumors about me, the ones about me being ugly, I started them myself." The confession hit him like a physical blow. "You? Why?" "It was a disguise," she said, her gaze intense. "The only way to get close to you, the only way to get inside the walls of this ranch. An unwanted bride is invisible. No one asks questions about a woman they pity." William's mind reeled. The shame he'd felt. The town's mockery. It had all been a performance, a carefully staged play, and he had been the lead fool. "Get close to me for what?" he snarled. "To help whoever is trying to destroy me?" "No," she said, taking a step closer. "To stop him." She held up her right hand, pushing back the sleeve of her dress. There, on the delicate skin of her inner wrist, was a brand, an ugly, scarred mark of a letter T inside a circle. "Do you know this mark, Mr. Carter?" He stared at it. He'd seen it before. On cattle, the brand of his biggest, most ruthless rival, Jedediah Thorne. "Thorne," he breathed. "What does this have to do with Thorne?" Everything, she said, her voice now filled with a cold fury he'd never heard before. My town wasn't just burned, it was erased. Thorn wanted the water rights that ran under our land. When my father and the other homesteaders refused to sell, he sent his men in the middle of the night. They locked us in the church and set it on fire. The horror of her words washed over him. He could almost smell the smoke, hear the screams. They killed my family, William. My mother, my father, my little brother. I was the only one who got out. I was pulled from the flames by one of his men, who gave me this mark before leaving me for dead. She was shaking now, the memory raw and alive in her eyes. I've spent the last 2 years hunting him, learning his methods, his weaknesses. I learned that he was coming for you next. You're the last big player standing in his way. Suddenly, it all made a terrible kind of sense. The cut fence, the dead foreman, the poisoned well she'd predicted. She wasn't his enemy's accomplice. She was his enemy's enemy. The marriage, he said, the pieces clicking into place. It was your only way in. It was my only way to get close to the one man in this territory powerful enough to help me stop him, she confirmed. But Thorne's network is everywhere. He has eyes and ears on every ranch, including this one. There is a traitor among your men. He stood there, stunned into silence. This woman, his wife, wasn't just a survivor. She was an avenger. She had walked into the lion's den, using his own pride and the town's prejudice as her shield. He had thought he was marrying a simple, plain woman. Instead, he had married a fire, a walking, breathing wildfire bent on revenge, and she had just pulled him right into the heart of the inferno. He made his choice right there in the barn, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. He would trust her. Not because he was a good man, but because he was a smart one. His empire was under attack, and this woman, this stranger with a fire in her eyes, was the only one who seemed to know the enemy's game plan. It was a partnership born of pure, desperate survival. They became a war council of two. In the evenings, they no longer sat on the porch in silence. They huddled over his maps in the study, lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. She pointed out vulnerabilities he'd never seen, security flaws in his own routines that had been in place for years. She thought like a wolf, not a sheep. Thorne preys on predictability, she told him. He'll expect you to send more men to the northern well, so we won't. We'll send them east and make it look like we're moving the herd. It was a dangerous game of bluffs and counter-bluffs. William started to see his own land not as a home, but as a battlefield. He felt a grudging respect for her turn into genuine admiration. She was brilliant. She was fearless. And she was slowly teaching him to be the same. The loneliness that had haunted him for years began to recede, replaced by the electric hum of shared purpose, of shared danger. The attack came at dawn, just as she had predicted. But not at the northern well. A coordinated assault hit 3 different points along his southern fence line simultaneously. It was a full-scale invasion. Thorne wasn't just trying to sabotage him anymore. He was trying to wipe him out. Gunfire erupted across the ranch. Men were shouting, horses screaming, the air filled with the stench of gunpowder. William grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding. But when he looked at the woman beside him, her face was a mask of cold fury. She was already armed, a pistol in one hand and a rifle in the other. "To the main house!" she yelled to the ranch hands. "Use the windows! Don't let them get close!" She moved with an efficiency that was terrifying, her commands cutting through the panic. She wasn't just a strategist, she was a field commander. They barricaded themselves in the main house, turning the sprawling building into a fortress. For hours they fought back Thorne's men. Bullets splintered the wood of the walls. Windows shattered. 2 of William's men went down, and he saw his wife, this woman whose real name he didn't even know, risk her own life to drag them back from a window, tearing strips from her dress to bandage their wounds. During a lull in the fighting, as they reloaded their weapons in the dim light of the living room, William's most trusted ranch hand, a grizzled old-timer named Silas, approached him. "Boss, we can't hold them off forever," Silas said, his face pale with fear. "They've got us surrounded. Maybe if you give them what they want, give them her." He nodded toward Eleanor, who was across the room. William stared at him, disgusted. "Never," he growled. "We don't surrender." "It ain't about surrender," Silas pressed, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Thorn wants her. That's what this is all about. He's been hunting her for years. Just give him the girl, and he'll let you be." In that moment, William felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. How could Silas know that? How could he possibly know what Thorn wanted? And then he saw it. A flicker of movement. Silas's hand was inching toward the pistol on his hip. The traitor. The spy had been Silas all along. The man he'd trusted for 20 years. Before William could even react, Silas drew his gun and leveled it at his chest. "I'm sorry, boss," Silas said, his eyes cold and empty. "But Thorn pays better." The world seemed to slow down. William saw the hammer of the pistol pull back. He was dead. This was how it ended. Betrayed in his own home. But then, a deafening crack echoed through the room from behind him. It wasn't Silas's gun. Silas's eyes went wide with shock. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. William spun around. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the study, smoke curling from the barrel of her pistol. Her face was grim, her eyes hard as diamonds. "I told you there was a traitor," she said, her voice steady. "I just wanted to see if you were smart enough to see it yourself." She had known. She had used the entire siege, their lives on the line, as a final brutal test of his loyalty. And he had, just barely, passed. But the battle wasn't over. Thorn's army was still outside, and they had just killed his inside man. The real fight was about to begin. The death of Silas changed the tide. Thorn's men, now without their inside source, were disorganized. The element of surprise was gone. William and his new, terrifyingly capable wife led a ferocious counterattack. They didn't just defend, they pushed back. They used their knowledge of every ditch, every rock, every building on that land as a weapon. By midday, Thorn's men were in full retreat, leaving several of their own behind as they fled back into the prairie. The ranch was a wreck. The smell of blood and smoke hung heavy in the air. But they had held. They had won. That evening, as the exhausted ranch hands tended to the wounded and repaired the damage, William and the woman he called Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the last of the sun disappear. The victory felt hollow. Thorn was still out there. This wasn't an end. It was just the beginning of a war. "He won't stop," she said, her voice quiet. "He'll regroup and come back with more men. He never leaves a job unfinished." "Then we don't wait for him to come back," William replied, the words feeling strange and new in his mouth. He had spent his life building defenses, protecting what was his. The idea of going on the offensive was foreign to him. But looking at her, he knew it was the only way. "We take the fight to him." A small, grim smile touched her lips for the first time. "Now you're starting to think like a survivor," she said. Over the next week, they planned. She knew Thorn's operations inside and out, his supply lines, his key allies, the smaller ranchers he was blackmailing. They didn't have an army to match his, so they would use his own tactics against him. They would become ghosts. They rode out at night, just the two of them. They visited the small ranchers Thorn was squeezing, the ones who had been too afraid to stand up to him. William, the powerful cattle baron they had always feared, now came to them as an ally. But it was his wife who convinced them. She showed them the brand on her wrist. She told them her story. She spoke of their shared enemy, and her voice carried the power of righteous fury. One by one, they agreed to help. They would provide information, create diversions, and sow chaos within Thorne's network. They systematically dismantled his empire of fear. They intercepted his whiskey shipments, spooked the cattle he'd stolen from other ranchers, and used his own spies to feed him false information. They turned his web of deceit into a trap. And with every small victory, William felt himself changing. The cold, proud baron was being stripped away, replaced by a man fighting for more than just land. He was fighting for justice. He was fighting alongside a woman who had shown him what true strength was. The final confrontation had to be public. It had to be a spectacle that Thorne couldn't escape. The opportunity came in the form of a county land auction in the main town. Thorne had rigged it, of course. He was planning to use threats and intimidation to buy up the last remaining independent plots of land, cementing his control over the entire territory. It was to be his coronation. They decided it would be his execution. The auction house was packed. The air was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and cigars. Jedediah Thorne stood at the front, a mountain of a man with a cruel smile, basking in the fear he inspired. The auctioneer began, his voice trembling. William and his wife entered from the back, and a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to them. Thorne's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a look of pure hatred. William walked to the front of the room. He didn't carry a gun. He just stood there and started to speak. He told the assembled ranchers and townsfolk about the cut fences, the poisoned wells, the murdered men. He accused Thorne of being a thief and a killer. Thorne just laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "Big words from a desperate man?" he sneered. "Where's your proof, Carter?" "The proof," William said, his voice ringing with authority, "is standing right beside me." His wife stepped forward. She held up her arm, the sleeve pushed back, showing the scarred brand to the entire room. "This is Jedediah Thorne's mark," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The mark he gives his property, the mark he gave me after he murdered my family and burned my town to the ground." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Thorne's face went purple with rage. "Lies! She's a hysterical woman!" he roared. "She's no one!" "She is not alone," a new voice said. From the back of the room, a woman stepped forward. She was a widow whose husband had died in a mysterious hunting accident a year earlier. She too pushed up her sleeve. On her arm was the exact same brand. "He did it to me too," she sobbed. "He took my land, and he said I belonged to him now." That was it. The dam of fear broke. Another man stood up, shouting that Thorne's men had threatened his children. Another accused him of rustling his entire herd. The room erupted into a chorus of accusations, a tidal wave of anger that had been held back for years. Thorne was surrounded, his power evaporating in an instant. The town sheriff, a man who had long been in Thorne's pocket, saw which way the wind was blowing. He moved forward, his hand on his pistol, and placed Jedediah Thorne under arrest. The war was over. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The prairie seemed peaceful for the first time in months. The sun was setting, the same way it did every day, but tonight it felt different. It felt like a promise. They stopped their horses on a ridge overlooking the valley, the vast expanse of William's land stretching out before them. His land, which she had saved. He turned to her. The setting sun caught the fire in her hair. He had seen her command men, face down death, and dismantle an evil man's empire. He had fallen in love not with the beautiful face he saw in the church, but with the warrior he'd seen in the smoke and chaos. But he still didn't know her name. "You never told me," he said softly. She looked at him, a real, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. It transformed her face, making her more beautiful than ever. "It's Anna," she said. Anna. It was a simple name, an honest name. It suited her. Anna? He repeated. I was a fool, back at the church. No, she said, her smile softening. You were what I needed you to be. Proud, arrogant, blind. It kept you from asking the questions that would have gotten me killed. He realized then that the rumors of her being ugly had been more than just a disguise. They were a reflection of the ugly world she had been forced to navigate, a world that had tried and failed to break her. Her true beauty wasn't in her face. It was in the simple, incredible fact that she had survived it. He reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm, real. Their marriage had started as a contract, a lie, a means to an end. But it had been forged into something real in the fire of betrayal and battle. It wasn't about an arrangement or an heir, or even about love as he had once understood it. It was about standing together on a dusty ridge, knowing you had faced the worst the world could throw at you, and you had won. It was about knowing you were finally home. The Texas Panhandle is full of stories like this, where secrets are buried just beneath the dust, and the truth is often more shocking than any lie. If you want to hear more strange, dark, and mysterious tales where justice finds a way, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.